During World War II, more than 500,000 women were deported to Nazi concentration camps. In these spaces of extermination and absolute degradation, they were not only victims, there were also perpetrators, collaborators, and accomplices within the same system. Many of them were selected for forced labor, medical experiments, or key logistical tasks in the machinery of death. Others, transformed into guardians of the regime, brutally imposed the ideological terror of the Third Reich. Gender offered neither protection nor excuses, only distinct roles within a structure designed to eliminate, exploit, or control. What secrets does the history of the women at Auschwitz hold? What kinds of decisions did they make within that system? And above all, how were they judged, punished, or silenced after the collapse of the Reich? Hell behind the wire. Women in the Auschwitz system. Between 1940 and 1945, Auschwitz became not only the darkest symbol of Nazi terror, but also the site of an extermination machine unprecedented in modern history. Within this complex, women faced a particular form of brutality, systematic, calculated, and designed to destroy not only their bodies, but also their identity as human beings. The Auschwitz complex was divided into 3 main, interconnected camps, each with specific functions within the deadly machinery of the Third Reich. Auschwitz I, established in May 1940 on a former Polish army barracks, served as the administrative and initial detention center. It was here that the first tests with Zyklon B gas were conducted, using Soviet prisoners as experimental victims. Auschwitz II-Birkenau, built 3 kilometers from the original camp, became the true core of the extermination system. Its area, equivalent to 175 football fields, housed most of the lethal facilities, 4 main crematoria with built-in gas chambers, capable of murdering and processing thousands of bodies daily. The women's section of Birkenau, the largest in the entire complex, occupied an area enclosed by electrified barbed wire fences, where women from all over Europe were crammed together. Finally, Auschwitz III-Monowitz, established in October 1942, represented the perfect fusion of extermination and economic exploitation. Adjacent to the IG Farben synthetic rubber plant, it used prisoners as slave labor until they were physically exhausted. More than 200,000 women were deported to Auschwitz between 1942 and 1945. Half were never registered. They were sent directly to the gas chambers after disembarking the trains. The temporary survivors came from virtually every occupied country: Poland, Hungary, France, the Netherlands, Greece, Italy, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union, among others. Their origins were as diverse as the reasons for their detention. Jews persecuted for racial reasons, Roma considered racially inferior, political resistance fighters, lesbians classified as deviants, and even women whose only crime was helping persecuted people. The mass deportation reached its peak during the spring and summer of 1944, when more than 400,000 Hungarian Jews were transported to Auschwitz in a period of just 8 weeks. More than half were women and girls. By then, the extermination machinery operated with industrial precision. It could process 12,000 people daily from their arrival until their ashes were scattered in nearby ponds. Arrival at Auschwitz marked the beginning of a carefully calculated dehumanizing process. After disembarking from the freight cars where they had spent days without sufficient food or water, the women were separated from the men. Under the barking of dogs and the shouts of armed guards, they lined up to face the first decision about their fate: selection. SS doctors like Josef Mengele, Heinz Thilo, and Fritz Klein decided, with a simple movement of their hands, who would live temporarily and who would die that same day. The criterion was purely utilitarian: young, physically strong women on the left for forced labor, pregnant women, elderly women, mothers with small children, or sick women on the right, directly toward the gas chambers. The latter were not even given an identification number. For the camp administration, they never officially existed. The women's barracks at Birkenau represented a new level of physical degradation. Originally designed as stables for 52 horses, each block housed between 600 and 800 women. Overcrowding was such that it was impossible to lie down completely during the night. The beds consisted of wooden platforms where up to 8 women slept on each level, without mattresses or sufficient blankets, even during the harsh Polish winters when the temperature dropped to 20 degrees below zero. Sanitary conditions were virtually non-existent. The blocks lacked adequate windows, thermal insulation, or heating systems. A single barrel served as a night latrine for hundreds of women, and the outside restrooms consisted of long, hollowed-out structures over open trenches with no privacy or toilet paper. Access to water was so limited that personal hygiene became almost impossible, turning the simple act of washing one's face into a luxury. These conditions created the perfect environment for the spread of disease. Typhus, transmitted by lice that infested uniforms and barracks, caused more deaths than the national teams themselves at certain times. Tuberculosis, dysentery, edema due to malnutrition, and various skin infections spread unchecked, causing the slow death of the weakest. The food hardly deserved the name. The daily diet consisted of a bitter black liquid called coffee in the morning, a watery soup with rotten vegetable scraps at noon, and a portion of black bread with a thin layer of margarine or jam at night. The total caloric value ranged from 700 to 1,300 calories daily, while forced labor required at least 2,500 to maintain basic bodily functions. Malnutrition manifested quickly: generalized amenorrhea, loss of muscle mass, edema, and finally the condition known as Muslim. The camp term for those who reduced to walking skeletons had lost all emotional response and were close to death. The work assigned to women varied according to the needs of the camp and the associated industry. The luckiest worked in the kitchens, laundries, or sewing workshops within the perimeter. Others were sent to the outer commandos, forced labor groups in quarries, swamp drainage, or construction, where exposure to the elements and the relentless pace caused rapid physical deterioration. Beginning in 1943, with the increase in weapons production, many prisoners were transferred to factories such as Weichsel Union Metalwerke, a Krupp subsidiary. There, during 12-hour shifts, they manufactured fuses for artillery shells under extremely low safety conditions, handling toxic substances without protection. The discipline imposed on the women was based on a system of constant terror. Infractions, real or imagined, received extreme punishments, from standing for hours on the camp esplanade, regardless of the weather, to receiving 25 lashes on a special trestle. Executions for attempted escape or resistance were carried out publicly by hanging or shooting in the back of the head, with the other prisoners forced to witness. One of the most perverse strategies of the concentration camp system was the creation of internal hierarchies among the victims themselves. Authorities designated prisoners as capos, block leaders, or work supervisors. These women exercised direct control over their fellow prisoners and received small privileges in return: additional rations, better housing, or simply the chance to survive another day. Merciless experiments, women victims of Nazi science. Under the guise of supposed medical research, doctors in the Third Reich used female bodies as disposable material to test racial theories, develop mass sterilization methods, and test new drugs without any regard for human suffering. In this distorted medical universe, three names stood out for their direct involvement in experiments on women: Karl Klauberg, Horst Schumann, and Josef Mengele. Each operated with complete autonomy within the concentration camp system, supported by the Nazi hierarchy and financed by the German pharmaceutical industry. Karl Klauberg, a renowned gynecologist before his association with the Nazi regime, arrived at Auschwitz in 1942 with a specific goal: to develop a non-surgical mass sterilization method that could be efficiently applied to millions of racially undesirable women. After receiving direct authorization from Heinrich Himmler, he set up his laboratory in Block 10 of Auschwitz III, where he injected chemical irritants such as formaldehyde, iodine, and silver nitrate directly into the uteruses of Jewish and Roma women without anesthesia. These substances caused severe inflammation that permanently blocked the fallopian tubes. In his reports to Himmler, Klauberg boasted that a team of 10 doctors using his technique could sterilize 1,000 women daily, an industrialization of reproductive control perfectly aligned with the racial engineering goals of the Third Reich. At the same time, Horst Schumann was experimenting with radiation sterilization. His method involved exposing the reproductive organs of men and women to massive doses of unprotected X-rays, followed by the surgical removal of ovaries and testicles to study the histological effects, usually without anesthesia and with unsterilized instruments. The appeal of this method for the regime was its potential covert application. It would allow large groups to be sterilized without those affected being aware of it until years later. Josef Mengele, the infamous Angel of Death, though primarily known for his research on twins, devoted considerable attention to pregnant women, Roma, and those with physical characteristics he considered abnormal. He personally selected his subjects at the arrival ramp, induced premature births for comparative anatomical studies, injected dyes into eyes to try to blue them in accordance with the Aryan ideal, and performed crossbreed transfusions between unrelated twins. His research lacked real scientific value. It followed no protocols, failed to maintain adequate control groups, and was designed to confirm pre-existing racial prejudices. These 3 doctors were part of a systematic program that responded to specific objectives: demographic control of undesirable populations, pseudo-scientific justification of theories of racial superiority, and the development of pharmaceutical products using human subjects available without ethical or legal restrictions. The methods employed combined calculated cruelty with bureaucratic efficiency. The selected women were categorized as experimental material, their bodies reduced to reservoirs of organs, fluids, and tissues for analysis. The most common procedures included intrauterine injections of caustic substances, exposure to ionizing radiation, surgical removal of reproductive organs, deliberate inoculation with diseases such as typhus or malaria, and the administration of experimental pharmaceutical compounds under development. The pain caused was so intense that many victims lost consciousness. Others developed massive infections that led to death within days. Those who survived were left with permanent after-effects: sterility, chronic pain, disfigurement, and irreversible neurological damage. A particularly disturbing dimension was the active involvement of German pharmaceutical corporations. Companies such as IG Farben, a conglomerate that included Bayer, Hoechst, and BASF, maintained formal agreements with the Auschwitz administration. Historical archives reveal that Bayer purchased specific groups of prisoners to test drugs under development, paying approximately 170 Reichsmarks per person. An internal report recovered after the war notes with clinical coldness. The subjects died during the trial. We have requested shipment of another batch. This collaboration allowed pharmaceutical companies to accelerate the development of commercial products without the legal and ethical restrictions they would have faced under normal conditions. The women selected for these experiments were housed primarily in Block 10 of Auschwitz I, a 2-story building isolated from the rest of the camp by high walls and with covered windows to prevent outside vision. This space functioned as a permanent human laboratory, run by SS doctors, German nurses, and medically trained prisoners forced to participate under threat of death. The victims rarely left the building except to be taken to the crematorium when the experiments were completed or when their physical deterioration rendered them useless for further research. Despite efforts to destroy evidence before the camp's liberation, significant documentation was recovered: detailed medical records with photographs and anthropometric measurements, records of reactions to treatments, autopsy reports, photographs of procedures, biological samples preserved in formalin, and correspondence between doctors and various German scientific institutions. These files document with clinical precision the magnitude of the horror of approximately 3,000 women who passed through Block 10. The mortality rate ranged from 65% to 85%, depending on the type of experiment. Angels of Death, the SS guards of Auschwitz. The machinery of death at Auschwitz was not operated exclusively by men. Between 1942 and 1945, approximately 200 German women served as Offizierinnen or SS guards at the compound. These women, far from softening the concentration camp regime with a supposedly feminine sensibility, became executioners as ruthless as their male counterparts, demonstrating that the brutality of the Nazi system transcended gender barriers. The recruitment of female guards intensified in 1942, when the expansion of the concentration camp system coincided with the increase in military needs on the battlefronts. Candidates came primarily from the German working class and petite bourgeoisie, office workers, shop assistants, nurses, and housewives. Few had higher education or prior experience with militarized structures, but all underwent intensive ideological indoctrination at the Ravensbrück training camp. For approximately 2 months, they received training in National Socialist ideology, surveillance techniques, and disciplinary methods. They learned how to handle the whip, conduct body searches, detect prohibited objects, and participate in selections. The most efficient were sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where the largest women's section of the Nazi concentration camp operated. Within Auschwitz, the guards were organized into a defined hierarchical structure. At the top was the Oberaufseherin, or chief guard, a position held primarily by Maria Mandel. Under her command were the Rapportführerinnen, report officers, the Blockführerinnen, barrack leaders, and the Kommandoführerinnen, work group supervisors. Although they were not officially part of the SS, an organization that only admitted men, they operated under her direct authority. They did not carry firearms, but had whips, batons, and trained dogs as instruments of control. The warders' daily duties encompassed every aspect of the camp. They oversaw morning and evening head counts, where prisoners remained motionless for hours regardless of the weather. They escorted the work commandos to factories or quarries at a grueling pace. They oversaw food distribution, and they conducted surprise inspections of barracks. Their most sinister role occurred during selections, where they forced women to strip naked for medical inspection and then escorted the selected women to the gas chambers. Of all the female guards who served at Auschwitz, Irma Gräser became a symbol of this feminine brutality. Born in 1923, she joined the SS at just 19 years old after a failed attempt to train as a nurse. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, she quickly rose to become the supervisor of the women's camp, where she developed her own methods of torture. Gräs used a custom-made whip, which she primarily used to strike the prisoners' breasts and genitals. Her boots, made by prisoner shoemakers, had metal reinforcements on the toes to maximize the damage. She regularly singled out young, attractive women for particular humiliations in what appeared to be a mixture of sadism and jealousy. Post-war accounts describe her visible pleasure in the suffering of others and her willing presence at executions. Her youth and Nordic appearance contrasted dramatically with her demeanor, earning her the nickname Beautiful Beast among the prisoners. Maria Mandel represented a different kind of cruelty, systematic, cold, and bureaucratic. Born in 1912, she was older and more experienced than most guards. Before arriving at Auschwitz in 1942, she had served at Lichtenberg and Ravensbrück, where she perfected her administrative methods. She maintained a professional and detached appearance, rarely personally participating in beatings, but she routinely signed punishment orders that resulted in torture or death. Her specialty was selection. With a simple gesture, she determined who would live or die. It is estimated that more than 500,000 women were sent to the gas chambers under her direct supervision. One of her most disturbing initiatives was the creation of the Auschwitz Women's Orchestra, an ensemble of female prisoners who played as transports arrived or as columns of workers marched to the factories. This juxtaposition of classical music and mass extermination exemplified the cultural perversion of Nazism. The guards' attire was an important element of their authority. They did not wear the black SS uniform reserved for men, but a blue-grey uniform consisting of a knee-length skirt, blouse, double-breasted jacket and cap. They wore insignia indicating their rank and the eagle and swastika emblem. Many complemented this basic uniform with knee-high black leather boots and matching gloves, creating an intimidating appearance. The cane or riding crop they carried served as a physical extension of their power and as an instrument of immediate punishment. The transformation of ordinary citizens into brutal guardians reveals the power of ideology and the institutional environment to shape human behavior. Several factors contributed to this moral metamorphosis. Intensive ideological indoctrination that normalized violence against enemies of the Reich, a hierarchical structure that diluted individual responsibility, geographic and social isolation that created a universe with its own rules, absolute power over dehumanized beings, and an incentive system that rewarded cruelty and punished compassion. The wardens not only followed orders but also developed their own initiatives to demonstrate loyalty and efficiency. They competed among themselves to win the approval of their superiors, designed innovative punishments, and ensured that their subordinates carried out the harshest measures. This internal competition constantly radicalized the system, driving it toward ever more extreme levels of violence. The post-war myth that women participated in the Nazi system only under duress or ignorance has been completely disproved by historical evidence. The Auschwitz guards were not willful automatons, but active agents who repeatedly chose cruelty when other options were available. There are documented cases of guards requesting transfers or moderating their behavior without suffering serious consequences, demonstrating that a margin of choice existed even within the system. With the approach of the Red Army in January 1945, the guards participated in the evacuation of the camp and the infamous death marches westward. Thousands of weak and sick prisoners were forced to walk in extreme winter conditions without adequate food or shelter. The guards, fearing capture while the camp was operating, were particularly vicious during this final phase, summarily executing those who could not keep up. After the Nazi defeat, many female guards attempted to disappear into the German civilian population, changing their names and destroying uniforms and identification. However, systematic efforts by the Allied forces, combined with testimony from survivors, led to the identification and capture of the main perpetrators, who would later face justice in various international and national courts. Between love and order, forbidden relationships in Auschwitz. In the rigid universe of Auschwitz, where every aspect of existence was regulated by Nazi racial ideology, personal relationships between guards and prisoners constituted one of the most severe possible transgressions. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 had explicitly criminalized intimate contact between Aryans and Jews, labeling it racial contamination, Rassenschande, and punishing it with sentences that could include death. Within the concentration camp system, these prohibitions took on even greater severity, creating a framework where any personal connection crossed multiple forbidden lines. Racial segregation represented the ideological core of Nazism. The regime had built its entire legitimacy on the supposed need to protect the purity of German blood against corrupting influences, particularly Jewish ones. Heinrich Himmler, as Reichsführer SS, had issued specific directives prohibiting any personal contact between SS members and prisoners, especially if the latter belonged to inferior races. These orders not only reflected concerns about military discipline, but also embodied the regime's eugenic vision. Auschwitz staff received explicit instructions during their training. Prisoners were to be treated as objects, not as human beings. Any empathy or preferential treatment would be considered an ideological betrayal and a serious disciplinary offense. These rules were regularly reinforced through briefings, surprise inspections, and an internal surveillance system where guards monitored each other. However, the everyday reality of the camp created situations where these barriers blurred. SS personnel and prisoners coexisted in shared spaces for extended periods. In certain areas, such as administrative offices, garment workshops, or the staff laundry, regular and less supervised contact created opportunities for unregulated interactions. This was the context in which several documented cases of relationships emerged that, while developing under extreme conditions of inequality, defied the strict racial prohibitions of the system. The most extensively documented case is that of Franz Wunsch and Helena Citronova, a story that emerged during the post-war trials and illustrates the moral and emotional complexities that could arise even in the most dehumanizing environment. Wunsch, an Austrian born in 1922, joined the SS after the Anschluss and was stationed at Auschwitz in 1941. As an Unterscharführer, sergeant, he was assigned to the so-called Commando Canada, the section where the confiscated possessions of deportees were sorted. Helena Citronova, a young Slovak Jewish woman born in 1922, arrived at Auschwitz in 1942 on one of the first transports from Slovakia. After surviving the initial selection, she was also assigned to Commando Canada, where conditions, although terrible, were slightly better than in other sections of the camp. Indoor work, occasional access to clothing or food hidden among confiscated belongings, and less exposure to the elements marginally improved the chances of survival. The first significant contact between the two occurred during a birthday celebration for an SS officer in 1942. Helena, who had been a singer before her deportation, was forced to perform songs to entertain the staff. Her voice caught the attention of Wunsch, who began to show her differential treatment, additional rations, occasional exemption from harder duties, protection from other guards. This situation intensified in 1943 when a new transport brought Helena's sister, Rosa, to Auschwitz, along with her 2 young children and husband. Following standard protocol, the children and husband were sent directly to the gas chambers. Desperate, Helena wrote a note to Wunsch pleading for her sister's life. In an extraordinary act within the system, Wunsch located Rosa among those selected for extermination and managed to transfer her to Commando Canada, saving her from immediate death. This act, which directly violated the chain of command and camp protocols, demonstrated a bond that transcended the normal relationship between guard and prisoner. In the following months, Wunsch continued to protect both sisters, providing them with additional food and assigning them to less demanding duties. Other guards and prisoners noticed this, generating tension and suspicion. Wunsch himself was warned several times by his superiors about his improper behavior. The true nature of the relationship between Wunsch and Helena has been the subject of historical debate. During Wunsch's trial in Vienna in 1972, Helena testified that he had expressed romantic feelings for her, but that the relationship was never physically consummated. She recounted how he confessed to her that he wished the war would end so he could take her home to her mother. In the camp, even these expressions of affection represented a radical transgression of racial and institutional norms. What makes this case particularly significant is its subsequent documentation. After the war, Wunsch was tried for his participation in Auschwitz. Helena and her sister Rosa testified in his favor, describing how he had protected them at risk to his own safety. Although he had participated in the extermination apparatus, the court considered these actions to be mitigating circumstances. Wunsch was sentenced to prison, but received a considerably lighter sentence than other SS officers of similar rank. The Wunsch-Citronova case was not unique, although it was exceptional due to its extensive documentation. Camp archives and post-war testimonies mention other similar situations, albeit with fewer details. An SS man identified as Alois H. was transferred from the camp after being discovered regularly delivering food to a Polish prisoner. An administrative officer, Wilhelm R., was demoted and sent to the Russian front after his colleagues reported overly familiar behavior with a Jewish prisoner working in the offices. The official response to these transgressions varied depending on the circumstances, the hierarchical position of the person involved, and their connections. Documented sanctions included disciplinary transfers to combat units at the front, demotion and loss of privileges, detention in SS facilities, and, in serious cases, formal prosecution for racial disgrace that could result in lengthy prison sentences or even execution. For the female prisoners involved, the consequences were invariably more severe. Unlike SS personnel who could manipulate the bureaucratic system or receive protection from superiors, female prisoners had no rights within the camp. Common sanctions included transfer to punishment sections, assignment to deadly labor, public physical punishment, and in cases involving sexual relations with German personnel, especially for Jewish women, execution was the usual response. It is crucial to analyze these relationships from the perspective of the structural imbalance of power. At Auschwitz, SS members literally controlled the prisoners' lives and deaths. Concepts like consent or voluntariness lost their traditional meaning. Any relationship developed under implicit or explicit coercion, regardless of the intentions or feelings of the guard involved. For the prisoners, these relationships primarily represented survival strategies. In an environment designed for extermination, where death was the predetermined horizon, establishing connections with powerful people could mean the difference between life and death. An extra ration of food, an extra blanket during the winter, or simply avoiding being selected for the gas chambers were crucial advantages. Even in cases where genuine feelings emerged, as possibly occurred with Helena Citronova, they developed in a deeply distorted context. Gratitude for basic acts of humanity, absolute dependence and extreme isolation created complex psychological dynamics that cannot be compared to relationships under normal circumstances. The invisible resistance, women in the Sonderkommando and rebellions. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, where Nazi power seemed absolute, one of the most extraordinary acts of resistance of the Second World War emerged. On October 7, 1944, As the Third Reich began to crumble on the battlefronts, a group of Sonderkommando prisoners achieved the unthinkable. They partially destroyed Crematorium 4 and killed several SS guards before being crushed. This rebellion, the only successful armed insurrection inside a Nazi extermination camp, would not have been possible without the crucial participation of a group of women prisoners whose role has often remained secondary in historical narratives. The term Sonderkommando, or Special Commando, referred to groups of Jewish prisoners forced to perform the most horrific tasks of the extermination process, guiding victims to the gas chambers, removing corpses after gassing, removing gold teeth, cutting hair for industrial use, transporting bodies to crematoria, and disposing of ashes in nearby rivers and ponds. These men were not voluntary collaborators, but individuals selected under threat of immediate death, forced to process the bodies of their own compatriots and relatives. The SS administration kept these prisoners in conditions of extreme isolation. They lived in separate barracks, often chained at night, with no contact with the rest of the camp. They received improved rations not as a privilege, but as an operational necessity to maintain the physical strength required for their gruesome work. The most disturbing feature of the system was its predetermined temporality. The SS periodically eliminated these entire groups to erase direct witnesses to the extermination. Members of the Sonderkommando knew that regardless of their obedience, they would be executed after 3 or 4 months of service. This certainty of imminent death created a unique psychological situation where rebellion, although seemingly suicidal, became the only way to die with dignity. By October 1944, the men of the Sonderkommando had begun organizing an uprising, but faced seemingly insurmountable obstacles. They lacked weapons, were constantly under surveillance, and their facilities were located within the most tightly controlled perimeter of the camp. It was here that the role of the female prisoners became crucial. A few kilometers from the crematoria, the Weichsel Union Metalwerke munitions factory, a Krupp subsidiary, operated where hundreds of female prisoners worked grueling shifts manufacturing war material for the Reich. Under constant but less intensive surveillance than in the main camp, some of these women had access to gunpowder for explosive charges, a material closely guarded but essential to any attempt at rebellion. 4 women stood out in this clandestine operation: Rosa Robota, Alla Gertner, Regina Saphirstein, and Esther Weisblum. Rosa, a Polish Jew born in Cieszano, had been active in Zionist youth organizations before the war and maintained contacts with resistance movements within the camp. As a supervisor in the warehouse for clothing for murdered women, she had a certain freedom of movement that would prove crucial. Alla, Regina, and Esther worked directly in the munitions factory, in positions that allowed them limited access to small quantities of explosives. For months, these women developed an ingenious system for extracting and smuggling gunpowder. They hid tiny quantities in clothing seams, blouse hems, and even in their body cavities during inspections. The gunpowder was transferred through a chain of intermediaries until it reached the Sonderkommando barracks, where it was stored in empty tin cans and damp rags to prevent accidental explosions. The risk these women took was incalculable. The discovery of even a small amount of gunpowder would have resulted in torture to extract names and public execution for those involved and anyone associated with them. Communication between Sonderkommando members and the factory women exemplified the creativity of the resistance. They used messages hidden in garbage, signals during work commutes, and occasionally notes written in Yiddish or Polish hidden in the seams of clothing passed through the camp laundry. On October 7, 1944, the conspiracy was precipitated by the arrival of orders to transfer 300 members of the Sonderkommando. From experience, they knew that transfer meant imminent execution. The insurrection, originally planned for a later date, had to be brought forward. Using improvised grenades made from smuggled gunpowder, they attacked the guards at Crematorium 4 and detonated a charge in the main furnace, partially disabling it. The rebellion spread rapidly. In the initial chaos, prisoners at Crematorium 2 also rose up, using tools as improvised weapons. SS Unterscharführer Willy Fries was killed, while other guards were wounded. A small group of prisoners managed to cut through the barbed wire and temporarily escape, although they were recaptured and executed in the following days. The SS response was immediate and brutal. Armed reinforcements surrounded the crematoria and suppressed the uprising within hours. Approximately 250 Sonderkommando members were executed on site or in the following days. However, Crematorium 4 was significantly damaged and never returned to full operation, reducing the camp's extermination capacity at a critical time when the Nazis were accelerating executions in the face of the Soviet advance. After crushing the rebellion, the SS launched an exhaustive investigation to identify all participants, especially the explosives suppliers. Through systematic torture, interrogations, and forced denunciations, they eventually identified the 4 main women involved in the gunpowder smuggling. Rosa Robota was arrested first, followed by Alla Gertner, Regina Safferstein, and Esther Weisblum. They were taken to the dreaded Block 11 of Auschwitz-the-Bruin, known as the Death Block, where the political department, Camp Gestapo, conducted interrogations and torture. For weeks, they were subjected to brutal sessions to extract names of other collaborators. Despite extreme suffering, they managed to protect numerous accomplices by limiting their confessions and assuming the majority of responsibility. On January 6, 1945, just weeks before the camp's liberation by Soviet troops, the 4 women were publicly hanged. The execution took place in the last Appell formation of the women's camp, with thousands of prisoners forced to watch as a final warning. According to later reports, Rosa Robota's last words were nekama, revenge in Hebrew, a cry that symbolized her determination to resist until her last breath. The Sonderkommando revolt is extensively documented in various sources. The immediate German reports recovered after the war mention a mutiny that required special measures and include casualty lists and structural damage. The Soviet investigation following the camp's liberation documented damage to Crematorium 4 and recovered traces of improvised explosive devices. Additionally, several documents buried by Sonderkommando members were discovered in the post-war years, confirming details of the uprising's planning and execution. Maps and plans of Auschwitz-Birkenau show the significant distance between the munitions factory and the crematoria, highlighting the extraordinary logistical effort involved in smuggling explosive materials through multiple checkpoints. Crematorium 4 was located at the western end of Birkenau, while the factory was located east of the main complex, which required transporting the gunpowder across virtually the entire perimeter of the camp. The significance of this rebellion transcends its limited military success. It represented an act of human affirmation at the very heart of a system designed to deny all humanity to its victims. It demonstrated that even under conditions of extreme oppression, and in the face of certain death, resistance was possible. Every gram of gunpowder smuggled, every secret message exchanged, every improvised grenade constituted a negation of the Nazi claim to absolute control. Women's contribution to the resistance at Auschwitz was not limited to smuggling explosives. Other forms of resistance existed, less dramatic but equally significant in the context of the camp. Many women participated in mutual support networks that shared food, medicine, or information, contradicting the individualistic logic that the system attempted to impose. Some risked their lives to document crimes, such as the members of the Krakoa group, who kept secret records of medical experiments, or the administrative workers who copied documents for later use in trials. Cultural resistance was equally important. Prisoners with educational backgrounds organized clandestine sessions where they recited poetry, taught languages, or discussed literature, preserving a mental space independent of Nazi control. These activities, though seemingly small, represented an affirmation of identity and humanity in an environment designed to destroy both. After Auschwitz, trials, verdicts, and sentences. With the defeat of the Third Reich in May 1945, the crimes committed at Auschwitz-Birkenau gradually emerged into the global consciousness. For the Allied powers and the newly liberated states, an unprecedented challenge arose: how to bring justice to crimes of such magnitude. What legal framework could encompass the industrialized murder of millions? And specifically, how to prosecute the women who had actively participated in these crimes. Between 1945 and 1949, various legal proceedings were carried out against female Auschwitz staff, implementing different legal frameworks depending on the jurisdiction, the specific defendants, and the available evidence. These trials sought not only to punish individual perpetrators, but also to establish a historical record and create legal precedents for future cases of crimes against humanity. One of the most significant trials was the so-called Auschwitz trial, held in Kraków, Poland, between November and December 1947. The Polish Supreme National Tribunal indicted 40 former camp staff members, including 6 women who had served as SS guards. The defendants faced charges of participation in the camp's criminal apparatus, selection of prisoners for extermination, application of deadly punishments, and complicity in genocide. The tribunal applied a legal framework that combined traditional Polish law with emerging principles of international law on war crimes and crimes against humanity. Among the most notorious defendants was Maria Mandl, who had served as Oberaufseherin at the women's camp in Birkenau. The court found her guilty on all counts and sentenced her to death. The sentence was carried out by hanging on January 24, 1948, at Montelupik prison in Kraków. Therese Brandl, another guard tried in Kraków, had served at both Auschwitz and other camps. Court records document her direct involvement in selections and the administration of physical punishments that often proved fatal. Brandl was also sentenced to death and executed along with Mandl. Louise Dans, who had served as a barrack supervisor at Birkenau, faced similar charges but received a life sentence due to less conclusive evidence of her direct involvement in the murders. After serving approximately 10 years, she was released in 1957 for medical reasons, a decision that generated considerable controversy in Poland. The Kraków trial set important precedents. It rejected the argument that the women had been mere subordinates following orders, affirming that even in hierarchical structures there was room for individual moral choices. It meticulously documented how the guards frequently exceeded their official instructions, developing their own methods of brutality, and it established that the crimes committed at Auschwitz constituted a special category that transcended common crimes. Meanwhile, in Lüneburg, Germany, the Bergen-Belsen trials, September 17 to November 17, 1945, were being conducted by a British military tribunal. Although focused on crimes committed at Bergen-Belsen, this trial included charges for actions at Auschwitz, as many staff members were transferred between the two camps during the 1944 to 1945 evacuations. Irma Gräser was the central defendant in this trial. The tribunal found her guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, sentencing her to death. She was executed by hanging on December 13, 1945, at Hamelin prison. At 22, Gräser became the youngest war criminal executed under modern international law. The British trial placed particular emphasis on visual and material documentation of the crimes. Official photographs of the defendants in office, recovered SS uniforms, and weapons used for punishment were presented. This forensic approach set important precedents for future war crimes tribunals, establishing evidentiary standards for mass atrocities. In addition to these major trials, numerous female guards faced lower courts or denazification proceedings in various Allied jurisdictions. The German Spruchkammern, denazification chambers, prosecuted many lower-ranking female guards, generally resulting in administrative sanctions such as bans from public employment or fines. The legal proceedings against the female Auschwitz staff faced particular challenges. A partial legal vacuum, as traditional penal codes did not address crimes of this scale, the destruction of much physical evidence during the camp's evacuation, and linguistic and psychological complexities in the testimony, which required translation between multiple languages and consideration of witness trauma. To overcome these obstacles, the tribunals developed innovative methodologies. They combined national legal principles with emerging concepts of international law. They expanded the definition of admissible evidence to include administrative documents, photographs, and physical objects, and they established special protocols for traumatic testimonies. These adaptations established fundamental precedents for future international criminal law. The documentation of these trials constitutes an invaluable historical archive. The records include complete transcripts of proceedings, sworn statements, photographic evidence, and thousands of administrative documents from the camp rescued before its destruction. These archives, preserved primarily at the Polish Institute of National Remembrance, the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum, and collections in Israel, the United States, and Germany, provide not only legal evidence but also essential primary sources for historical research. The forensic aspects of the executions are equally well documented. Official reports describe the procedures employed, medical confirmation of death, and disposition of remains. These records reflect a deliberate effort to contrast the brutal informality of the killings at Auschwitz with the structured, documented, and legally sanctioned application of the death penalty after due process. During the 1950s, with the intensification of the Cold War, political interest in prosecuting Nazi criminals waned in many Western jurisdictions. Some female guards sentenced to long prison terms were released prematurely through partial amnesties or for purported medical reasons. This trend generated considerable controversy, particularly among Holocaust survivors and communities affected by the Holocaust. Debates over commutations continue to inform contemporary discussions about transitional justice and appropriate punishment for crimes against humanity. A significant legacy of these trials was their contribution to international law. The trials of the Auschwitz personnel, along with the Nuremberg trials, established crucial precedents later codified in the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, 1948, the revised Geneva Conventions, 1949, and decades later in the Rome Statute that established the International Criminal Court. These processes redefined fundamental concepts such as command responsibility, superior orders as defense, universal jurisdiction for certain crimes, and the legal characterization of genocide. They established that mass atrocities were justiciable even when committed within national legal frameworks and under apparently legitimate orders. This legal evolution represents one of the most significant advances in international law in the 20th century. The trials of female Auschwitz staff specifically challenged stereotypical notions about female involvement in violent crimes. Historically, legal systems had tended to treat female perpetrators more leniently, assuming a reduced capacity for violence or greater susceptibility to external influence. The courts that tried female SS guards explicitly rejected such presumptions, applying identical standards of criminal responsibility regardless of gender. Decades after these initial trials, justice continued to pursue former Auschwitz guards. In 1975, Hermine Braunsteiner-Ryan, known as the Mayor, for her habit of kicking prisoners to death, was extradited from the United States to West Germany to face charges for her service at Ravensbrück and Majdanek. Her extradition set important precedents regarding the impossibility of escaping responsibility through migration. The Auschwitz staff trials represented a pivotal moment in post-war legal and moral history. They established that even the most extreme crimes could and should be prosecuted through formal legal systems, not through extrajudicial revenge. They demonstrated that no ideological or political system could exempt itself from basic moral standards. They meticulously documented the systematic nature of Nazi extermination, countering future attempts at denial or minimization. However, these trials also revealed the inherent limitations of retributive justice in the face of crimes of such magnitude. No sentence, however severe, could adequately compensate for the massive suffering caused. No judicial procedure could resurrect victims or restore shattered communities, and no punishment could guarantee that such atrocities would not be repeated in the future. The judicial response to the crimes of Auschwitz laid the groundwork for future international tribunals that would try atrocities in Rwanda, Yugoslavia, and elsewhere. Each new tribunal has refined methodologies, expanded witness protections, and developed more sophisticated legal frameworks, but all rely on the precedents established in these early efforts to bring justice after the Holocaust.